Right, so now we have, in this lesson today, we're gonna look at planes and axes. Okay, when we discuss movement, we normally say the movement is happening in a certain plane. Okay, and there's three different kinds of planes that we're gonna look at first. Okay, we'll have a look at the axis afterwards. Okay, so on the left here, you can see what I've done is I've drawn a great picture of a person there, and the plane divides the person from front to back. So you've got a back half and a front half. Okay, but you've just got to remember that the plane is as if you're looking at it from a front on, so it's called a frontal plane. That's called a frontal plane. Okay, so any movement that's happening, okay, in that particular plane. Okay, when it says that, it means any movement that you can kind of imagine, movement that you could measure would be happening in that plane. Okay, and I'll explain that a little bit more afterwards. The next one, we have what is called the sagittal plane. Okay, now the sagittal plane, remember this has got a double T, okay, not a double G, a double T. Okay, the sagittal plane, okay, divides the body between a right and a left. Okay, so the plane goes down the middle. So that's effectively what's happening is the camera angle, okay, is looking at any movement from side on. Okay, so that's the side on plane is the sagittal plane. Okay. We then have the transverse. Okay, plane, which is when you've got, say, this is when you have, say, for example, you're looking down from above the object or the person, okay, and the plane divides the body, between an upper half and a lower half, so right through the middle of the body. Okay, so that's that plane. So imagine the camera angle was coming down there, and here the camera angle was coming from the front. Okay, the reason why I say camera angles is if you think about a plane as in from a camera angle, it might help you remember it a bit better. Okay, so for example, any movement that's happening in the frontal plane, okay, so even though you can't see my head, any movement that's happening from a frontal plane, let's turn this around here. Okay, will be any movement like that. Okay, so it'll be at the shoulder, it'll be abduction, adduction. Okay, at the hip, it'll be abduction, adduction. Okay, and it might be any kind of movement in that sort of direction, or the head. Okay, so that's the frontal plane. Okay, the camera angle is from front on, and it's having a look at movement in that plane. Okay, that is not a movement in the frontal plane because you can't measure. Okay, if you were to say try and measure the angle of hip flexion, you can't measure that because that movement is happening in a different plane. That would be from side on. So whereas if you were to measure the angle of abduction, that would be 90 degrees. So you can tell quite easily in that plane that angle of shoulder abduction is 90 degrees. Whereas, and the same thing here, that angle of hip abduction would be, say, 45 degrees. Okay, but you wouldn't be able to tell the angle of hip abduction if I went like this. Okay, you wouldn't be able to tell the angle. Okay, the sagittal plane, so that was the frontal plane. Sagittal plane is side on. So try and remember S for side. Okay, sagittal, side on. So now any movements that occur in the sagittal plane, okay, will be things like where you can measure them. Will be elbow flexion. Will be shoulder flexion. So shoulder flexion, that would be 45 degrees shoulder flexion, that would be 90 degrees shoulder flexion. Elbow flexion, that would be 90 degrees shoulder flexion, elbow flexion, that would be 45 degrees elbow flexion. Okay, same thing there with the hip, that would be 90 degrees hip flexion, okay, and that would be 45 degrees hip extension. Okay, and then again, finally at the ankle, you could have a look at the amount of plantar flexion and dorsiflexion going on. All right, so that's the side on sagittal plane. Okay, movements happening in the sagittal plane. Okay, or anything where you can measure it. You couldn't measure okay, elbow flexion from a frontal plane. You can't see the angle there. Whereas from a sagittal plane, you could measure the elbow flexion. Okay, so that's sagittal plane. Transverse plane is pretty much anything. So if you now have a look at shoulder, horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. Okay, horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. So that would happen in, say for example, like tennis. Okay, the racket would come through like that and you would have horizontal adduction. Okay, the same thing would happen. Okay, other things you could look at are like a discus thrower, the amount of rotation that they go through. That would be done from the transverse plane, from above. Okay, because then you can see the angle. You can't see the horizontal adduction from a frontal or from a side. You can't see that angle, but you can see that angle from the top. You could measure the angle. So that would be 45 degrees, that would be 90 degrees. Okay? So that's the planes. Right? Then you have axis. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, so the axis is, it's a straight line in which an object or a body rotates or turns around. That's the definition of an axis. So normally they come in pairs. So the frontal, for a frontal plane movements, okay, all of the movements occur in the it would be the sagittal axis. So this is what we need to try and remember. So I do this all the time as well. So I go, it's a memory tool, and it goes Sophie takes Fleur shopping to London. So what we're looking at is S, T, F, S, T. Okay. Now these two go together, these two go together, and these two go together. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Yep. So the first one is, if we know it's if we know that we've got a frontal plane, okay, that means that it's going to be a sagittal axis. So that's this one here, okay? So I should have actually got this in a different. So the F and the S go together. So you've got a frontal plane, means that you've also got a S, so it means the sagittal axis. Now the sagittal axis, it's hard to see on here. The sagittal axis actually goes through from the back of the body to the front of the body. Okay? So as you could imagine, the sagittal axis would be, imagine if you had, if you got the pen there, that pen there going through my hip joint. Okay? That means that any movement there is rotating around that axis. Okay? If you've got the axis going through there, that's called the transverse axis, that means that that would be any kind of movement happening there. Okay, and then you've got the longitudinal axis, which is basically that is going down through the head. Okay, and that would be any kind of rotation, okay, going around that axis, because that axis is going from top to bottom. You need to have something rotate around that. So anything rotating, so shoulder abduction would be an axis going through there, because you're rotating around that axis. Okay, so the axis going from front to back, okay, is the sagittal axis. The sagittal axis is going from front to back. Okay, the frontal axis, or sorry, so you've got, so the frontal axis, okay, so you've got a sagittal axis, longitudinal axis, and a frontal axis. transverse axis. Sorry, transverse axis. Okay, so any movement happening, so any the axis going across there, okay, would be the transverse. Transverse means going across. Okay, so the transverse axis would work for the elbow. Okay, it would work for the shoulder hip flexion. Shoulder flexion, and then the transverse would work for hip flexion and hip extension. Okay, gets a bit confusing sometimes, but let's simplify. Okay, so we've got a frontal plane. Okay, so that means that we've got frontal sagittal axis. Okay, frontal. Let's have a look at sagittal axis. The sagittal plane. Okay, we're then having a look at the transverse axis. So anything that's happening in that, so from side on, we're looking at a transverse axis. So the transverse axis goes across. Okay. So transverse axis, as I mentioned before, okay, would be anything like hip flexion, hip extension, shoulder flexion, elbow flexion. Okay, you get lots of different movements that happen in the sagittal plane and the transverse axis. And then finally we have the transverse plane, okay, which is the two transverse, and then you have the longitudinal, so L, you have the longitudinal axis. Longitudinal axis. So the longitudinal axis goes down the body there. Okay, so if like I said, when you're filming from above, then you're looking at any movement that happens around the longitudinal axis. Okay, so any kind of any rotation or any kind of sort of shoulder horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. Okay, so let's put this all together. And have a look at how they pair up. So we know that, remember, we've got Sophie takes Fleur shopping to London. So these two, we've got sagittal and we've got transverse. So that's the plane, that's the axis. That's the plane, that's the axis. That's the plane, that's the axis. So the next one is T is transverse. The next plane is F, so F stands for frontal. Then we have an A, so the A, sorry, we've got the axis, so we've got the S, so it stands for sagittal. We've got the T, it stands for transverse. And L for longitudinal. Okay, now these two go together, these two go together, and these two go together. So generally, if you said, what axis do movements happen around when you're having a look at the sagittal plane? That would be the movements that happen in the sagittal plane normally happen around the transverse axis. The movements that happen in the frontal plane, okay, so front on, normally happen around the sagittal axis. And the movements that happen in the transverse plane normally happen around the longitudinal axis. Okay, so you have to just remember how these pair up. Okay, sagittal transverse, frontal sagittal, and transverse longitudinal. You just have to remember that. But the best way to remember it is Sophie takes Fleur shopping to London. Okay, Sophie takes, those two go together. Fleur shopping, those two go together. And to London, those two go together. All right. So how that then works is, for example, you have a discus thrower. Okay, this guy is just about to throw the discus. and it's been filmed from above. You can't really see much else there. You literally just see his head, the arm, you can see sort of just about see his feet. Okay, so we need to think, if it's being filmed from above, what plane is that? Okay, if it's being filmed from above, okay, we're having a look at how the body is split that way. So this is the transverse plane. And what axis are we having a look at now then? Okay, so if this movement is happening around here, okay, that's happening down an axis that's going straight down the body. Okay, so we're having a look at the longitudinal axis. Okay, now that's a fairly tough one. Okay, but just remember, if it's discus and you're having a look at the amount of shoulder or the amount of rotation, the only way you can measure the rotation is from above. So you know that that's the transverse plane. Okay, and if that rotation's happening around, like say the spine, okay, then you know that that's it's an axis going from the top, from the head down to the feet. So it's a longitudinal axis. Try a different one. If we have a look at what other examples have we got here? A hurdler from side on. Okay, this hurdler, they've got one foot out there, and the hurdle is there. Okay, one foot's gone over it and the other foot's come back here. Right, you're having a look at, so this is, we're side on. The camera angle is side on. We're having a look at the amount of hip flexion that's happened there. All right, so side on would mean that it would be the sagittal. So side on would be sagittal plane, and the axis we're looking at is it's going across the body from left to right, going through the body from left to right that way. Okay, so we would be having a look at if it was sagittal. So remember we had Sophie takes. Sophie takes. So the takes, the T would be with the axis, that would be the transverse. Transverse. Axis. Transverse axis. Right. So as long as you can actually link these, okay, transverse and axis, to any sporting actions, okay, they are on the PowerPoints. Have a look at those sporting actions. If you can do that, then you're fine. All you need to know is how the planes link with the axis. So you know that you've got Sophie takes Fleur shopping to London. So it's the first letter of each of those words. They go together. So Sophie takes, ST. S is the plane, T is the axis. S is sagittal and T is transverse. Okay? So it'd be sagittal plane, transverse axis. All right, so, and if it was a sagittal plane, it means that you're looking at it from side on. Okay, if it was, if you're looking at it from front on, okay, if you get a picture with an athlete that's front on, then you know it's a frontal axis. Okay, Fleur shopping. So the next one is shopping, so it's S. So it's a frontal plane. S stands for sagittal, so it'd be sagittal axis. Okay, and if it was from above, okay, we know that that's a transverse plane. Okay, and we know that T, so it's to London, so L would be the longitudinal axis. Okay, try and apply it to different kinds of sports. Look at the PowerPoint. Hope this helps. Sweet.